It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to my first regional series of the year, the Washington State Wine Deep Dive 2021. I'm of course Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, and across 3 episodes we will explore the terroir, geology, winemaking culture, and of course the wines of the US's second largest quality wine producing region. Guests are drawn from landmark producers in the Columbia Valley, the Yakima Valley, and Walla Walla, each uniquely placed to translate the larger story that each glass of Washington State wine represents. We begin our series with an in-depth look at Washington's largest viticultural area, the Columbia Valley. Guest Juan Muñoz Oca is head of winemaking and vineyards at Chateau Saint Michel, which is indeed the largest winery in Washington State. He takes us through the macro influences on grape growing in the region, including the Missoula floods, the largest known movement of water in our collective history, before bringing us up to date with a virtual tour of modern-day Columbia Valley. He introduces us to the culture of winemaking in Washington, before leading a tasting of 4 Chateau Saint Michel wines, the 2018 Columbia Valley Chardonnay, the 2017 Pundit Syrah, the 2016 Solare Cabernet Sauvignon, before finishing with the 2019 Columbia Valley Riesling. One then looks ahead for the future of Washington wine, both in the short and medium term. Enjoy.
My name is Juan Muñoz Oca. I'm the chief winemaker for San Michel Wine Estates, which is a collection of wineries based in Washington State in the northwest of the United States. I've been with San Michel for 19 years now. And before that, I worked in 5 different countries in 4 different continents, always in winemaking. I grew up in Argentina, in wine country in Mendoza, fell in love with wine at a very early age, and I never thought about doing anything other than being a winemaker or a viticulturist. At some point in my early teens, I thought I should be a footballer, but you know how that goes. Only a very few make it. So wine was it for me. I went to school in Mendoza. I studied viticulture and enology. I then continued my education in central Spain, where my family is from. Always focus on growing grapes and making wine, and trying to figure out what people will do around the world to better express the uniqueness of their terroir. My thesis work for my master's brought me to Washington State. And for reasons that I did not know at the time, I did my research on deficit irrigation. That's when you deprive the vines from water, you put them under a certain amount of stress, and they tend to make better wines when they are stressed, specifically when they are stressed at the right time during the growing season. And little did I know that in Washington State, it doesn't rain during the growing season. So it was the perfect climate for me to come and do the thesis work, my research, on an actual vineyard, and then being able to make the wines from that vineyard. When my advisor at the University of Valladolid in Spain told me, you're going to have to move to Washington State, I thought he was crazy. I'm like, Washington State, as in Seattle? Doesn't it rain in Seattle 24/7? I truly believed at the time that it rained indoor in Seattle. It was always wet. And he laughed, and he talked to me briefly about the Cascade Mountain. It's a mountain range that cut the state in 2, north to south. And so the east side of the state, where the Columbia Valley is, it's a rain shadow. And that rang true to me because growing up in Mendoza, of course, Mendoza is on the rain shadow of the Andes. So all the precipitation stays in Chile. And Mendoza gets about between 190 and 210 millimeters of precipitation every year. And here in Washington, we get about the same, 170 to 190. The difference with Mendoza, it rains in the summer in Mendoza, which is the growing season for the vines. And here in Washington, the combination of not a little rain and the little rain that we do get falls outside the growing season, mostly in the winter as snow, allows us to have a dry growing season between bud break and harvest. And because the Columbia River runs through the Columbia Valley, we take the water from the river to irrigate our vines, giving us incredible control over how they grow and when we can stress them, right? So that brought me to Washington. This was 2001, and I fell in love with the place, the terroir, the combination of factors make the place incredibly exciting. It gives us some flexibility, some liberties as grape growers that I haven't seen anywhere else in the world. And met my wife, who's a local, also a winemaker, and then became home. There is similarities between the Columbia Valley and many other regions around the world where I have worked. Yet it feels to me like the perfect climate for wine, simply because if I were to have a lovely dinner with 10, 20, maybe 30 of my winemaking friends from around the world, and I start asking them, what is it that you like about the place where you grow your grapes? And what would you like to change? I think collectively, we will come up with the place that looks a lot like Washington State. The lack of rain, the sunshine, the water availability, the range of temperatures during the growing season, it just makes a wonderful place to grow grapes. And the evidence is not only in the wonderful wines that we grow in the Columbia Valley in Washington State, but also, I think, the array of differences in styles and wines that we make. I think nothing better than a growing region that can allow winemakers to be creative and to think outside the box and do an array of different styles, varieties, all in one place, which is what Washington allows us as grape growers and winemakers.
Thinking back to all of the episodes that I've done, I'm very much aware that I haven't really spoken to anybody about this concept of deficit irrigation. And, really who better to ask than you? So I wonder if, you would maybe, take us a little bit inside that part of the story where you say you moved to Washington. What were you doing? What did the time there in terms of the study of deficit irrigation, what was that like for you, and what were sort of some of the key discoveries that came from that time?
So early on, we've known, since we've been growing grapes, specifically to make wine, we've known that when the vines are under certain type of stress at the right time during the growing season, they focus all their energy onto the cluster. They forget they have leaves and canes and root systems, and they focus all their energy onto ripening the cluster and the grapes for obvious reasons, right? If you are a vine, your goal for the season is to ripen the seed to propagate the species, but more importantly, surround that seed with a very aromatic, very flavorful, very colorful berry that will attract an animal that will actually eat it and take the seed somewhere else, right? In this case, the animal happens to be a winemaker, me. But we've known that for years. We've also known that in those regions in which you can irrigate, so apply water to irrigate the vines, you can also deprive the vines from water and apply this kind of stimulus of stress, make the vines think that they are under some kind of a stress. They just focus on the cluster, which ultimately, as a winemaker, that's what you want them working for. You want them to capture the sun energy and transform that into amazing flavors, deep and concentrated flavors on the berries. So what I was interested in understanding was if the vine that was under stress was as healthy as a vine that had all the water they could get.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea was on my thesis work was we should measure photosynthesis rate to figure out if the vines that are under stress are actually creating the same amount of assimilate, the same amount of energy, the vines that have all the water they can get. And ultimately, the thought was, if the vines that are under stress are healthy, we can do this year in and year out and never tinker with the lifespan of a vineyard. And so what I didn't want was to apply stress, get darker, richer wines, but short the lifespan of a vineyard or compromise somehow the health of the vine. And so in order to do so, we measure photosynthesis in the entire vine. We had a few rows of vines that were water was applied as the vine was taken from the soil. So we'd replenish the water that the vine needed. And then right next to it, we had a row of vines that were deprived from water at key times during the growing season. And I can talk to you about the key times in which we try to stress them and why. But the important part is at the end of the growing season, we made wines with these grapes to kind of prove the theory that these wines will be darker and richer and the phenolic composition of the wines will be better than those vines that got all the water they could get. And what we discovered was that both vines, stress or having all the water they wanted, produced the same amount of photosynthesis. Their photosynthesis rate did not change, which meant both vines were healthy and happy. What they did was just switch where those assimilates, where the sugar, where the energy was going to, right? And so instead of going to the entire vine to take care of their root system, etc., for those vines that were under stress, the energy went straight to the cluster and to not only go to the cluster, but also develop the things that the vine feels they need in order to get to that goal, which is great looking and smelling and tasting berry surrounding that seed that should be mature at some point during the growing season. And as winemakers, that became kind of an amazing thing to know. Like, vines are fine, they are healthy, we are not tinkering with the lifespan of a vineyard, yet we are allowing ourselves to create nuances into the wines that are very appealing to the wine drinker, which ultimately, if you make wines that have a point of view and you can increase the amount of attention that they get because of the way they present themselves, that's ultimately the goal for any given wine growing region.
This is really fascinating for me, and I haven't had this conversation on the podcast ever before, and it's really fascinating to essentially delve into what a winemaker will say when they say, we stress the vines. And I think people conceptually get that idea, but I think, the idea that you've studied this, that you have, I guess, perfected and honed that art, and that you're able to then demonstrate and carry that right the way through into the glass, I think will be really interesting to revisit when we get to the point where we're tasting some of these wines. Where I'd like to guide the conversation now is really to where you are now, to the Columbia Valley. And really, I think to introduce the listener to that region. I speak for myself and speak for my countrymen in the UK. We're not always the best on our geography of the US. And I think it's sometimes easy to overlook just how diverse that continent really is. And I've been blown away really by what I've seen and what I've learned about Washington State in doing my research before today. But really, who better than yourself, who has got your feet on the ground over there and knows and is intimate with the region. Zoom up a little bit and give us that wider context of the state and really, you've already mentioned a little bit about the rain shadow. What's happening, I guess, broadly and more easterly of those Cascade Mountains and of that rain shadow?
So this corner of the United States, the northwest corner of the United States, it's in itself as diverse as perhaps the entire continent of North America. But what's very interesting is that in about 4.5 hours in a car, I can drive from one of the wettest spots in the continental United States, right, on the Puget Sound, the Olympic Peninsula, where it rains, as I said earlier, almost 24/7. And then just a short drive over the Cascade Mountains will take you to one of the driest places in the continental US. Here, where in the Columbia Valley, we only get about 180 to 190 millimeters of precipitation every year. And so you can get an idea of what that means for a vine. A vine will take about 4 or 5 times more that amount of water to survive the season. And so literally in Washington, if we didn't have the Columbia River, which is the second largest, by the way, in the United States, if we didn't have the Columbia River to get the water from and irrigate the agriculture that we do in the Columbia Valley, including, of course, grape growing for winemaking, these grapes will not be able to survive. But what's amazing about the Columbia Valley, it's not only the rain, it's also because it's so up north, we do get a fair amount of sunlight during the growing season, a fair amount more than many other growing regions around the world, about 17 hours of sunlight in the heat of the summer here in the Columbia Valley. Sun goes up 5 o'clock in the morning, it goes down at 9:30 to 10 p.m., which allows these vines to really soak it in. And that combination of last year in the Columbia Valley in 2020, we had 307 days of cloud-free skies. And so it's sunny, it doesn't rain, and it has a temperature fluctuation between day and night that sometimes swings 10 or 15 degrees, which is amazing. And more importantly, towards the end of the ripening season, it gets kind of cooler really quickly. So you can let the grapes hang on the vine, continue to develop their flavor profile, their phenolic profile, continue to ripen tannins, for example, without a lot of photosynthesis that will increase the sugar content. So the wines tend to have a wonderful balance to themselves, where they have a phenolic structure with an amazing amount of color, great tannins, and yet we preserve the natural acidity, and the alcohol levels are never high. So it's a wonderful balance. And all of this, it's underlined by the fact that the soils in the Columbia Valley are very loose. So they have very poor water retention capacity, right? And they're very poor for a reason. Mm-hmm. There was an event that occurred thousands of years ago that we in the area know as the Missoula floods. There's a town in Montana, which is a state to the east of Washington. There's Washington, then Idaho, and then Montana. And there's a city now called Missoula, a town, the Missoula. But towards the end of the last ice age, there was a lake, Missoula Lake, that was formed by a natural ice dam that towards the end of the ice age, as I was saying, kind of broke many times, actually. And every time that dam will break, the water will rush through what's today the Columbia Valley towards the Pacific Ocean. And it was such a crazy amount of water, Lawrence. This is the largest movement of water in the history of our planet. And so that water rushed through, picture a mountain of water rushing through the Columbia Valley, literally taking all the soil with it. It will hit the Cascade Mountains, kind of recede for a few days. And those few days was when the deposits that were carried by the water were left behind as the water actually ran through the Cascade Mountains all the way to what's today the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is our neighbor to the south, and then ultimately hit the Pacific Ocean. Interestingly enough, we can see the layers, and each layer of this silty, sandy deposits. It's one of those flood events which we think happen many, many times. And this is such a incredible amount of water that we think that the natives and the animals that lived around in those states could have heard the water coming for about 45 minutes. So there were 45 minutes, they were thinking, what is that? What is that noise? And then a wall of water will hit them. Surprisingly enough, I think it's just something that we talked about in wine and perhaps geology for certain agriculture, and specifically in the Northwest, because it shaped the landscape the way we know it today. But as storytelling goes, I don't think we as Americans appreciate the event maybe as much as we should. But we certainly know about it in Eastern Washington. I have a 13-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son, and we were driving over on a ski trip once, and one of them said, well, those are the layers that the Missoula flood left behind. And I was proud parent moment, kind of pumping my fist under the steering wheel. But I think it's just, these two kids grew up with two winemaker parents, and so I think they had wine before they had Coca-Cola. But I don't think it's known. It was an amazing event or chain of events that shaped an entire region. And there's a couple of books that have been written about the Missoula floods, and of course, because I'm a geek and because I do what I do for a living, I have several copies of each of those. But I think the rest of the United States quite doesn't know what we talk about when we say the Missoula floods shape the Columbia Valley, and also the Willamette Valley, for that matter. To think about the scale, we have boulders in the Columbia Valley the size of a small car that were originally in Montana. And the water brought them here. Like you said, that milky, chocolatey wall of water brought very big rocks with it. And those were scattered around the Columbia Valley. And then as the water kind of slowed down on its way across the Cascades, just dropped all that, those sediments that left behind. It's the soil in which we grow our vines today.
This is fascinating, and I do again love that I'm able to bring something completely new to my audience. And I think, in this sort of scale of what we're talking about here, I think it would be incredible to really kind of close the circle and bring us right up to date in terms of the landscape, because as I say, a lot of what I've found out about those particular incidents and those movements of water have been focusing more on, as you say, the boulders and at a macro level, looking at the glaciers. But I'm curious then, what does that then mean for you really as a winemaker in that region? What is the landscape really that the floods have left behind and given the palette, I guess, of soils that it's given you to experiment with?
The landscape that we enjoy today, the pristine conditions in which we are lucky enough to make wines today in the Columbia Valley are a direct result of those catastrophic flood events on the last ice age. And what it did is, and it's taken us a little bit of time, but what it did is it left enough diversity within the Columbia Valley for us to discover and for us to evolve as a grape growing region. So the Columbia Valley, it's a massive area of grapes, includes almost all the grapes that we grow in Washington State, which is about 26,000 hectares last time we counted. And so it's a big area that then over the years, over the last 4 decades or maybe 5 decades, winemakers and grape growers have been able to dissect into smaller pieces of the Columbia Valley, which are our American viticultural areas, right? Our appellations today. And so as we make wine, and the wine is this thing where you pass the information from generation to generation, and what we do literally is based in what people that did it before us learned over the years. And so what we've done over the last 40 years is dissect the Columbia Valley into the smaller appellations that have a uniqueness to them. And that could be the elevation, that could be the way in the exposure to the sun. So it's a northern exposure, southern exposure, the river that runs through these little valleys within the larger Columbia Valley. And that gives a winemaker not only the ability to plant the right variety in the right place for the expression that we're looking in those wines, but also the ability to color outside the lines, which is something amazing about making wine in the New World, and perhaps more to the point to making wine in the United States is you have the ability to color outside the lines, do what you feel is right for the consumer. So you plant the variety that you think will deliver a wine that has a point of view, a perspective, and then you zoom into that to deliver a unique wine experience to a consumer versus being attached to the traditional variety in certain region that has also a traditional style, which has its fantastic merits. But I think this idea of having the freedom to dissect the region in smaller pieces that are showing even more unique characters, right? And then do whatever you feel is right for that one region. It's such a wonderful opportunity. And seeing all of this develop in front of my eyes over the last couple of decades, it's been just such an amazing experience. Lawrence, I normally I compare winemaking to chefs. I always think about chefs when I'm doing what I do for a living, and I envy their creativity. I envy being in the kitchen and the smells and the flavors, but more importantly, I envy how chefs get to cook every night. And so when you find a new ingredient, you discover a new technique, you picture a dish in your mind, and when you're composing that dish, you cook 7, 10, 20 times one night, and then again the following day, and then after a certain amount of time, you have perfected the dish, and it's in front of you, and it's evident that it's either very close to what you envision, or maybe far away, but yet you're happy with it. A winemaker has one chance a year to fulfill that vision of the wine, right? And if something quite doesn't go the way you want it, or you think you can pull a different lever or change a different detail about something within the fermentation, the growing season, or whatever the case might be, you have to wait 365 days to give it another try. And so, because we cannot evolve our techniques as quickly as a chef can, we of course lean on what other generations have learned about winemaking. And in the case of Washington, when it's kind of in wine years, we're fairly new, although Chateau Saint Michel, which is the flagship winery in the company that I work for, just celebrated we celebrated our 50th anniversary. But in wine years, that's yesterday. 50 vintages. A chef can go through 50 different takes on a dish in a night, right? And so I appreciate how we are not only learning more about what makes the place unique, but also trying to lean on different expressions within the Columbia Valley, right? So the Columbia Valley sets kind of the parameters for what we can and cannot do in Washington. And then we're trying to decorate our wines with more specific characteristics. So we go and fish out of little places. In the heart of the Columbia Valley, there's a little appellation, perhaps the smallest one in Washington, called Red Mountain. And Red Mountains happened so the water that came rushing through the Columbia Valley did kind of like a little swirling around this little hill. and created this unique combination of rock and sand that has a beautiful southern exposure. And because we're the northern hemisphere, we get better exposure to the sunlight. And it's just perfect elevation. And Cabernet Sauvignon grows there just beautifully, right? And so a handful of people realized this years and years ago. The Hedges family, who make amazing wines using biodynamic techniques, and it's all organic. And the parents founded the winery, and now the kids are taking it to new heights. And they showed up in Red Mountain, built the winery, and they decided that they will plant a handful of varieties, and Cabernet just shine. And so now Red Mountain is about 75% Cabernet Sauvignon. And those learnings in the last couple of decades have been just wonderful to see in front of our eyes. I feel like I'm in the very beginning of what will become a very influential wine region. And so that, as a winemaker, that the discovery that lays ahead is just very appealing, very appealing. And all of that is because we are learning to deal with the nuances that make the Columbia Valley an amazing place to grow grapes, with differences that might be small, but they have a tremendous impact on how the wines present themselves. And your audience and anyone that is interested in wine understands that the little nuances make a big difference, right? So little nuances at the beginning of the process from grape to table, little nuances throughout the process make big swings at the end of the day when we are enjoying wines with our friends, and how those wines present themselves, what varieties we're tasting, and the wine style ultimately.
You've already started talking there, really, and think reinforcing some of the things that I've noticed from my visits to the US. You know, I've already done quite extensive coverage on this channel of the New York region, specifically the Finger Lakes. And then last year, your neighbors to the south, down there in Oregon and in the Willamette Valley. And you've just there, you know, really without any prompting, you've brought up, I think, a theme that evolved on both of those two trips as well, which was around this sort of second generation almost phase of the wine community in each of those regions. And, you know, because of prohibition and because of various law changes along the way, this has been the start has been sort of within our lifetime. And I think that's very exciting, really, to kind of be at the dawn of something. And it's not an underestimation, you know, when you look back to a region in Europe and you know that they've been making wine on that hill for the last 900 years. You know that they pretty much they know that hill intimately, and they're probably quite set in what they're doing. But you don't have that. You know, you have, as you say, that kind of open mind and that kind of open spirit. And I'm curious then, potentially beyond the kind of multi-generation properties and farmers and families that you have there, I wonder, are you actually also attracting new winemakers, people that are kind of, I guess, enthused by all of the things that you've already mentioned, and think, you know, I've got a choice of where I want to make wine and where I want to kind of, you know, put down my roots, and Washington is the place for me?
What I've seen over the last couple of decades, which is inspiring and amazing when I pause and think about it, is people from around the globe that are passionate about wine, that think about, they see themselves being part of the wine business, and they see themselves being part of, more specifically, wine production, right? Grape growing or winemaking. And they study their options, and they look into what areas might give them the creative outlet that they are seeking. And you find time after time, you find people moving to Washington State to chase that dream. And it's an array of people that go from farmers in South America or grape growers in South America. They come to Washington seeking that perfect climate, that wonderful, almost perfect, picture perfect growing season that we have in Washington, or sommeliers from really prestigious restaurants in New York City and Miami and Chicago that fall in love with wine. They fall in love with Washington wine, and they find themselves making amazing wines in Washington shortly after. And all of this is decorated by the ability that you have to actually come to Washington with the point of view and see that point of view run through and shine through the glass. When you come to Washington and you say, I love the way Rhone Valley Grenache present itself, but I want to have a richer, darker version of it. And you come to Washington and you find yourselves with Syrah grown in the Yakima Valley. And you find yourselves growing kind of like the herbal nose and the beautifully fine-tuned tannin structure that you will find of the Syrah and the Rhone, yet it's darker and richer because of the sunshine or because of the tools that you have as a grape grower in Washington. So you can actually see in Washington your perspective shine through the wine once you go through it. And there's a few other elements that decorate also people choosing to make their wines in Washington, and it has to do with the opportunities that we present in Washington as we have this explosive growth within the wine industry. There is also the fact that Eastern Washington, it's kind of removed from the city. We're about 3.5 hours drive east of Seattle. And you find yourself with affordable living, and you find yourself that it's a place, Washington is a place in which you can buy a piece of land and make world-class wine without having to sell your grandmother's jewelry. And that you cannot say that for many places around the world, where if you want to make wines that have a point of view, wines that are true to the place where they grow, it's almost impossible to get a piece of land to plant some grapes. And in Washington, that's not the case. We have an abundance of agricultural land, a lot of knowledge about how things grow in Washington. And so everybody's welcome to come in, get a couple of hectares going and plant some grapes and see their dream fulfilled, which is amazing. Over the last week, I've talked to 3 winemakers in Washington State that were master sommelier that was in charge of the wine program at a very prestigious restaurant in New York City, a waitress from a restaurant in Chicago, and then a couple that were in the fashion industry. All 3 of them now call Washington home, and all 3 of them have now their own wineries. And so that array of people coming in, I think also fuels the innovation, and it fuels that the spirit, the entrepreneurial spirit that I think drives the Washington wine industry today.
Juan, this is giving me such an understanding, I would say, such an appreciation of what you've kind of got going on the ground over there. And just to give you the visual as well, I've been very restrained because we're going to be now tasting some wines, and these have been open and looking at me here. But I think it's high time to get into the glass. And I think, as always happens, wine I think is a lubricator of those stories. So I think it will be interesting for me to hear how what you've kind of set the groundwork and the foundation on there with talking about the terroir, the geology, and also the people who are on the ground there. How do they, and through your hands as well, how do they then show up in the glass?
The people that participate in in growing these grapes, and those folks who participate in making these wines, and then it stretches to the people that participate in selling our wines, the people that communicate the nuances of our wines to the consumer, the sommeliers that hand sell a bottle of Columbia Valley X variety because the customer asks for a refreshing glass of white wine or a very refined yet dense glass of red wine. I think that is perhaps the most important part of telling the story of a place. And the conditions in which you grow your grapes are important: the soil, the weather, the growing season, kind of climate. But I'm convinced that wines present themselves differently depending on who makes the wines. And I will take it even a step further, and I'll say it depends on who actually grows the grapes and how they feel about the industry. I personally see winemaking not only as creating this beautiful beverage that we all enjoy and indulge on, and like you were saying, kind of the cultural, social lubricant that fuels wonderful conversations and great nights with friends. I see wine as a force within the community, right? As winemakers, we shape the landscape of a region, right? Where it was in the Columbia Valley, for example, where it used to be just brown sagebrush in the lovely rolling hills around the Columbia River. It's now rolling hills of vineyards, right? And up in in Red Mountain, we have it's now dotted with beautiful wineries that are just a delight to visit and sit outside to have a glass of wine overlooking the Yakima River. And so we shape the landscape, and we give the community a creative outlet that at times is hard to find in an agricultural setting, right? And so in Washington in particular, in the Columbia Valley, and as part of all these wines that we're going to taste together today, which, by the way, they are looking at me, the glasses are looking at me, staring at me, and I cannot wait to get to them. But through all of this, we have about 65 growers that grow grapes for Chateau Saint Michel. And all of those are family-owned operations. Every single one of them comes from a family-owned operation that it's now in the transition to their second generation. And seeing that transition reminds me of how important wine can be for a region. Like I was saying before, I think it gives us this like amazing creative outlet that we otherwise wouldn't have in an agricultural setting. In Washington State, we also grow a good amount of wheat, and we grow corn, potatoes. We do a lot of fruit, apples and cherries and blueberries. And I'm having a hard time trying to figure out how a potato farmer opens up to the world by just growing potatoes, right? But now you're a grape grower, and suddenly you start making your own wine, which happened to a great amount of our growers. They started growing grape for us. We discovered it was kind of like a transition between not knowing what to expect to becoming a grape grower, and then actually becoming a really great grape grower, and then suddenly saying, well, I should have my last name in one of those bottles, and then like start making their own wines, right? And I have a number of examples of wineries that whose genesis is a family of growers that decide to go one step forward and show their craft through winemaking, and all of a sudden their wines are all over the place. And the Airfield Estates started with a vineyard called Airport, which we source today. And then at some point, the family decided we're going to make some wine. And Marcus, who's the winemaker and owner, called the winery Airfield after the name of the vineyard, Airport. And it's all kind of like aviation themed winery in Prosper, Washington, and it's beautiful. And now Marcus's wines are sold in the UK, and I think that potential to not only let your creativity shine and become a winemaker or a chef or a creative director or a marketing genius or even a wine sommelier, right? It's just directly related to having wine in the community where you are. And so I love how impactful wine is to the community and vice versa. I love how the community not only becomes very impactful in the wine that we make, but also it becomes an important part of how these wines present themselves. I don't see these wines tasting the way they are today without the hard work and dedication and passion that it's behind closed doors and the winemaking, but perhaps more importantly, the grape growing that we do in Washington. I tell people often that very few of us get into wine because of the without passion. I think it's very few, regardless of how you touch wine, even if you're a wine drinker. But if you earn your living, and your living is related to wine, there is a tremendous drive that is fueled by passion behind it, and that is such an amazing and inspirational industry to be related to, and Washington is not the exception. And so it's a tight community. It's a community that understands that there is a lot for us to learn, and there is a lot of nuances for us to discover, and a lot of room for us to zoom into smaller pieces of this place that we call home, to showcase even more nuances to the wines. So we have a handful of wines that will show us the range of capabilities that Columbia Valley presents to its winemakers, not only in varietal, but also in style. But also you'll see the range. We're lucky enough to have 4 wines from 4 different vintages that will run the gamut from 16 to 19. 16 was one of the hottest one on record for us. 19 was one of the coolest, and yet they're very tight together. So overall, the vintages in Washington State have a very consistent weather pattern. The nuances in Washington are tiny. The difference between 19 and 16 might seem like a rounding error to many grape growers around the world. But for us, are nuances that inform our grape growing and then the winemaking. And so I'm happy to have 4 wines that go from Chardonnay and Riesling to Syrah and Cabernet. So that shows range for the region. And then 4 different vintages that will also show a little bit of the how consequential the little changes in the climate during the growing season can be on the wine. The first wine, it's a Chardonnay. It's the Chateau Saint Michel Columbia Valley Chardonnay. It's the 2018 vintage, and it comes from an array of vineyards that are mostly in the Horsehaven Hills, which is the southern end of the Columbia Valley, just right next to the Columbia River. We, of course, grow some of these grapes in our own estate vineyard, which overlooks the Columbia River. But also, there's a couple of families that are big part of the growing of the Chardonnay for Chateau Saint Michel Columbia Valley. The Andrews brothers, there's Rob and Mike. Both of them are 4th and 5th generation farmers. At some point in the late 90s, they decided, well, maybe we should give these grapes a try. Chardonnay grows beautifully in the property, which is not far from the Columbia River, just maybe 10 kilometers north of the Columbia River. And so, funnily enough, both of them now own their own winery, right? And they make their own wines, and both of them make Chardonnay. But the idea is that we we try to protect the Chardonnay, we try to protect the grapes from too much sun exposure early on. And we do so by giving our vines a good amount of water to create a healthy canopy that will protect, maybe have 1 to 2 layers of leaves between the sunshine and the cluster. And so we want the temperature of the sunny days in the Columbia Valley to influence the flavor development inside the grape, but we don't want the sun hitting the skin of those berries because we want a phenolic profile that's very subtle. And so I think Chardonnay in Washington presents itself like the best of both worlds, right? We hold on to a good amount of natural acidity. I can get really geeky and talk about pH and the acidity of the wine, but trust me when I tell you there is a freshness to these wines that shines through the aromatic profile and then the texture of the wine as you're drinking it. And yet the flavors are fully developed and ripe. And those are things that sometimes don't go hand in hand, right? Sometimes as winemakers in many regions around the world, you have to decide we go for one or the other. We go for opulence and rich flavors and textures, or we go for freshness and acidity. And the beauty of Washington is that we think we can get them both, right? And I think the key is not only that we have hot days during the summer and cold nights. And when I say hot, I mean 34, 35 degrees. It's easy in mid-July for us. And then cold at night, I mean, we could go from 35 degrees to 14 or 15 at night. And so that helps the vine hold on to natural acidity. But I think more influential is the fact that in September, it's like we turn the AC on and it's been really warm June, July, August, and then in September, it just cools off really quickly. But it doesn't go really low, right? So it stays within the 20s for the daytime temperatures. And then 20 degrees is just perfect ripening temperature, right? And so you can still develop some flavors and textures. The tannins are still doing their enzymatic thing and getting together and forming different sensation. But there's not enough temperature for the vine to go through photosynthesis and add a lot of sugar to its composition, which sugar normally ends up being more alcohol after the fermentation. And so the wines present themselves just beautifully. And I think it's just that combination of just the right ripening conditions in September and October. September for the whites, October for the reds. And as we go through the wines, I'm going to bring this up a couple of times because I think it's perhaps the magic of wines in the Columbia Valley. It's that ability to bridge the best of kind of an old world freshness and then the new world ripeness and juiciness and getting the two together in one glass. It's perhaps Washington's secret weapon. So we'll go with the Chardonnay, and you'll tell me if you can tell that the dual the dual way in which the wine presents itself.
We're several thousand miles apart, but I think you've got the telepathy working there because it was exactly what I was thinking. That balance was really coming to mind, and actually, you know, the mind went to the cooler climate Chardonnays and potentially, the old world style, making the air quotes over here, and then that kind of more fuller, more fruity, maybe with more sort of oak or new oak acting. You know, the Chardonnay is a grape that can kind of take you to so many different places, and I would certainly draw out that balance there. You know, I'm definitely still getting that freshness. I'm getting the dryness. I'm getting the very much the refreshing note coming through there, and you know, potentially, you know, quite a sort of gastronomic note as well coming through. It does have that kind of savoriness that I think, you know, does sort of, for me, bring me back towards, you know, thinking about the food element. But there is certainly then, I'm getting it more sort of the mid palate and the finish. There is that fruit coming through, and I think what would, I'm curious then to know a little bit about what happens with this wine in the winery.
Yeah. So what we try to do is preserve the freshness, yet round the fruity characters at the end, and to do so, we decorate the wine with a little bit of new oak, so we can round the tannins and present the fruit, lift the fruit in a way in which it's respectful of the acidity, because, and this goes for all wines that we make in the Columbia Valley, they tend to be the perfect pairing for food, just simply because of the acidity and the way in which that acidity will cut through fat if you're having it with the protein, or the way in which that acidity will enhance the flavors of vegetables, especially if they're grilled, right? So what we do at the winery is about half of the wine we ferment in oak, and the other half will ferment in stainless steel. And I think that it's so it's 45% fermented in stainless steel tank, very cold, a very clean fermentation. And then we do the exact opposite in oak. About 55% of the wine will go to oak barrels. These tend to be barriques, which are 220 liters, although we are doing more and more over larger formats, 500 liters, 1,000 liters, 5,000 liters. And what we do there is we do kind of a dirty fermentation in which we intentionally let the juice be a little bit more dirty as it goes into the barrel to add flavor to the wine and texture. And then we, of course, leave the wine on the lees. Those are the solids produced during fermentation. We leave the wine on the lees for 9 months. And then after those 9 months, we bring the two components together. And that is when the fun happens, as we sit down and we try to compose the wine from the different components that we have. And that's when we are allowed to dial in the amount of fruit versus the bright acidity, and maybe even lean in some cases to bring yet another dimension. It's interesting that you mentioned kind of a savory tone to it. I think that it's a characteristic that runs through all of our wines. And I think that savory, almost like an umami texture, will just make these wines, beautiful wines, to drink on their own. They're interesting to be had by themselves, just when you're feeling like a glass of wine, but also immediately flips to become an amazing pairing for almost anything that you can think of having with Chardonnay. The Syrah that we are tasting today is called the Pundit, and it's made under a label we call Tenet. And the idea of Tenet is to showcase what Syrah can do in Washington State. We reach out to a couple of friends from the Rhone Valley to bring a little bit of their perspective. And so Michel Garcia and Philippe Cambier are our partners on the Tenet project, and they come from the Rhone, and they come with this amazing idea of how Syrah should present itself. And so they bring the old world sensitivity to the new world geography and help us understand how deep Syrah can take you when it comes to representing the place where it's grown. It's a variety that, in my mind, shows it's very transparent in regards to terroir. You immediately know if that Syrah was grown and made in Santa Barbara or the Rhone or South Australia, or in this case, Washington. And what they did for us was really interesting. And I think we eventually will have evolved into this, but they help us go quickly. They found a couple of vineyards in the Columbia Valley that spoke to them, right? So we tasted through all the Syrahs that we have in the house, and they found a couple that spoke to them. And then they encouraged us to not be as precise as we have been trying to be. You know, that idea of there's a little bit of beauty in chaos. And and they lean on, so they ask us to leave the oak behind, and you lean on the intrinsic qualities of the grape to develop the meat palate and round up the tannins through the fermentation process. So you don't use the oak as a crutch to refine the wine. You use the things that you have at your hands given by the vineyard. In their case, stems. So we use the stalk, and we do whole cluster fermentation, and we do the stems back into the fermenter in many different ways, but all of it trying to refine the tannin structure. And so you don't have to lean onto the micro-oxygenation that happens in the barrel in order for you to refine the wine. And it's brilliant because not only the wine presents itself in a beautiful way, but also it represents the place a lot better, right? Because you're not masking the wine with the same aromas that come from oak that I use, my wife used to make other varieties from other places, my buddy in Argentina uses for his Malbec. And, at the end of the day, all those flavors, I know they interact with the wine differently, but they tend to bring the wines kind of together. And so this technique is actually pushing this wine away from the rest of the Syrahs around the world. And it's been such a great experience for me to hang out with them, go out to the vineyards with them, learn about the way in which they perceive viticulture and the way they think about viticulture. But perhaps more importantly, once we get into the winery, this idea of like, okay, so a quarter of these grapes are going to be whole cluster. And then we're going to go through an extended maceration, which is when you leave the wine after it has fermented, you leave it in touch with the skins that you use during fermentation to extract color and flavor. So we're going to leave it there for a little while, which is unnerving, but it's fun. And undo a few rules that we had set for ourselves, which allows you to open your mind and do things differently. Although I did get a fair amount of weird looks from the cellar crew when I, been asking them for years and years, you take every piece of green material away from the fermenter. I don't want any green. And then now we find ourselves collecting stems, leaving them out in the sun to dry for a couple of days, and then taking them and dumping them into the tank on top of the cap. So when we do them, the cap is that thick layer of skins that forms on top of the tank during fermentation. We dump these stems on top of the cap so we can have some sort of control over how much we extract from them when we're doing a pump over and getting the wine through those stems. And these kids look at me like I'm from Mars. They're like, Juan, you're telling me I need to... That used to be garbage, and now we're putting it into the tank? Like, for real? Yeah. But I think the wine then has a beautiful herbal tone that's very interesting, and that pairs great with just the pure fruit that is kind of the backbone of the wine. And that it's a wonderful representation of that dual ability that Washington has to be kind of like rough and rustic on one end, but also refined and fully ripe on the other.
The differences of approach and all of these, I guess, different cultural things that have come here. Does that then mean that this is quite a different wine year to year? People are looking at different vintages of this wine. It's one that they sort of have to look for the vintage and know that there may be differences there. But then also just as a second kind of sub question as well, just around the styling of the bottle as well, because it's just fascinating for me to open up what, to me, I know we're using these huge terms, but again, what is for me quite a sort of an outgoing, more of a new world, more of a sort of attention grabbing label with a wine that I think because of all of the things that you referred to there is maybe more understated than the label might suggest.
It's so interesting that you picked up on that, because from the get-go with this wine, we decided that there was maybe a voice for Syrah, maybe story about Syrah that was not quite told well in Washington. And there is a handful of wineries in Washington, really high-end, incredibly successful, that focus on Syrah, that do an amazing job, but most of them are hard to find outside Washington state. Some of them impossible to find outside the Northwest. Many of them you won't find outside the United States. And so the idea was, because we have reach and because you can find this wine in the UK for about 25 pounds, the idea was for us to showcase that, give Washington Syrah a voice, and decorate that story with the nuances that make Washington unique. It's the idea that there's two winemakers from the Rhone Valley, which, by the way, those two have made together about 18 100-point wines in their winemaking career. Which, I'm full of envy for that fact with the two of them. But the fact that they can come to the Columbia Valley and find themselves kind of at home with the wines, and that they relate to what we go through as grape growers and winemakers, it's amazing. And so what we're doing is just maybe given that finesse and balance that they bring from their style, give that a little bit of attitude that maybe reads a little bit more like the young kids that throw the rule book out the window and started making whatever wines they felt were great to them. And bringing them closer to us. And I think that it's the way the bottle is, not only the bottle shape, but the label and the way in which we present these wines. It's so we can actually maybe convey that idea that the Washington is a paradox, and it's wet on the west side and dry on the east side, and we make wines that are refreshing and elegant, yet vibrant and ripe, and it's kind of a mix of all things good about wine. Earlier on in the podcast, we talked briefly about Red Mountain, which is this hill towards the eastern end of the Yakima Valley that form kind of a swirl during the floods, and so it's a mixture of rocks and silt and sand that has a southern exposure that is gentle yet very impactful, that grows perhaps some of the best Cabernet in the world. The one thing that I have not touched on during our time together, Lawrence, is the fact that in Washington State, most of our vines are unrooted, meaning we don't have phylloxera in Washington. Phylloxera did not like the winter. The winter is very, very harsh in Washington, with very, very low sub-freezing temperatures the entire month of December and January. Phylloxera doesn't like that, and phylloxera doesn't like the fact that our soils don't have a lot of water retention capacity. And phylloxera uses water to go from root to root, right? So they use that as the tube, like their form of transportation. If you don't have free water, they can actually not move around the vineyard. And so all those conditions allow us to grow our grapes on their own roots. And I have no proof of this, but I believe that vines that are on their own roots express the uniqueness of the varietal character more intensely. And at Red Mountain, Cabernet found just a wonderful expression of itself. And to help us develop that expression, we partnered up with the Antinori family from Tuscany. We earlier talked about generations of people passing their knowledge to the next generation. The Antinoris are 26th generation of winemakers. They have documentation of the family making wine in Tuscany in the early 1400s, which it's amazing. And so we built the winery at the top of the hill in Red Mountain in partnership with the Antinori family. So this is a winery we own 50-50, Chateau Saint Michel and Antinori. And it's another one of those experiences in which you blend the best of both worlds, right? So the European old world winemaking traditional way of thinking, right? So when we talk about the vineyard, Renzo Cottarella, who's their chief winemaker, he thinks about generations. He's like, what is going to happen to this vineyard for the next generation and the generation after that? So that it's help us frame the viticulture that we do in a very different way. And then we have this like ability of freedom to do whatever we feel like with the vineyard, right? We're not tied to any type of ruling on how we grow our grapes, the orientation of the road, the trellis system. And so it's a little bit of like a playground for Renzo, where he gets to create a new version of Cabernet Sauvignon, which is a variety that he's very well versed on because they make some of the greatest Cabernet in the world, and they're super Tuscans and also in Bulgari as well. So it's a playground for Renzo where he can just let his creativity go crazy, and then it's an amazing guidance for us to have their sensitivity kind of guiding what we do. The wine that we have today is the 2016 vintage of Solare. It's 100% from Red Mountain. It's mostly Cabernet, although we blend a little bit of Cabernet Franc at the end of malolactic fermentation. So the blend was put together kind of early on in the life of the wine. The wine does stay about 24 months in oak. And so most of that aging process, the wine was there as the final blend. And we bring Cabernet Franc to decorate the nose and add like a little maybe herbal note to the nose, and also to round up the tannins of Cabernet, which in Red Mountain grows intense yet very refined. And I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. It's the temperature in October when the mornings are cold, the top temperature in the day, it's maybe 15, maybe 16 degrees, and Cabernet loves that hang time when we're not adding any sugar, right? But we are developing the tannin, the polyphenolic structure of the wine. So the wine then has this black cherry, cinnamon aromas, and it's decorated with like maybe rose petals, right? Like subtle notes that perhaps are given by the Cabernet Franc. And it has a rich tannin structure that it's evident, yet very nice and silky. And I love that combo, which I think is what we love about really, really high-end red wine. All of us that love wine, that combination of tannins that are high quality, so they're evident, you know they're there, you can feel them, yet they're enjoyable and very silky. And I think Red Mountain finds that nice balance, specifically for Cabernet, and this is a wonderful example of it.
And I think, maybe this is a mea culpa moment, and I can gladly confess now that I've tried the wine and I absolutely love it. I will admit, it's at times it's difficult for me to get excited about Cabernet Sauvignon, where I see it as a monovarietal or as we have here, sort of a 94% versus 6% blend, by far the sort of dominant blend. And what's really taken me aback really is I'm getting all of those sort of details, I would say, that you're describing there, that sort of information, as I like to call it, from the vineyard, from the grape coming through. But then I'm again a little bit conflicted because you've earlier referred to 2016 being a particularly warm year, as being a particularly hot year over there, but yet still able to get those details there, still able to get that level of refinement and elegance and silk, I guess, which is another word that I like that you've used there. And it's not so much a question, it's more I'm just genuinely quite taken aback that all those things that maybe on paper, if you'd sort of told me all of those things before, I might have expected something a little bit more full blown, a little bit more in your face. But this is definitely not that. This is definitely more towards those things that you've just described there.
I'm so glad you liked it, and your comment about Cabernet, it's on point. I feel, but specifically about American Cabernet, I feel like at times we wrap the wine, we push it so far that, trying to extract more and make it deeper and richer. And then we at times over oak the wine, and it loses the nuances that make the wine drinking experience sublime, right? Mm-hmm. And so we think about all those things as we're putting the wine together, as we put the wine in oak, trying to find oak producers that can match the style that we need them to produce in order to lift the fruit, not cover it.
Let's get into the last wine that we've got here in our mega flight, and interesting for me that we're going from, again, that hottest year of the 4, I do believe, the 16, straight to the cooler of the 4 years, the 19.
One of the coolest, yeah. Magically traveling from one end of the spectrum within the winemaking capabilities of the Columbia Valley, which is Cabernet Sauvignon, to the other end of the spectrum, which is Riesling, and coincidentally traveling from one of the hottest vintages on record, which is 2016, to one of the coolest vintages on record, which is 19. And again, those swings in temperature in Washington are small and nuanced. And if I tell my friends that grow grapes in South Australia or Mendoza or the Maipo Valley in Chile that those were the difference in temperature between 16 and 19, they most likely will laugh out loud. But the wine that we have in front of us is Riesling. It's 2019 Columbia Valley Riesling, which is perhaps the one wine. So Chateau Saint Michel produces more Riesling than any other winery in the world by volume. And because of the size of our Riesling production, it's one of the varieties that we grow all over the Columbia Valley, right? And this is one variety that grows amazingly well in the Horsehaven Hills, which is the southern end of the Columbia Valley, all the way to Ancient Lakes, which is the northern end of the Columbia Valley, which, by the way, it's a good 2.5-hour drive between the two. And as well as growing beautifully right against the Cascades on the west side of the Columbia Valley, all the way to the limit in Walla Walla Valley on the east end. And so this is perhaps the most diverse, as it refers to the appellations in which, the sub-appellations in which it grows, but also allows us the opportunity to have some cooler versions of Riesling that will bring the acidity and the brightness of the wine, and some of the hotter places that will bring a little bit of a richness, sweetness. Evidently, we leave a good amount of residual sugar on the wine. This vintage has about 20 grams of sugar per liter. What's interesting to me is that the pH is 3.07. And for those geeks at home paying attention, that is a really low acidity, and sugar and acid balance each other, like the tomato sauce when you're making the red sauce for your spaghetti, and you add a pinch of sugar to counter the acidity. And I think the two of them find this wonderful balance in the Columbia Valley tier, which, by the way, it's an amazing amount of wine, like the quality of the wine for the price. I believe it'll be easy for you to find it in the UK for around £12.
Yeah,
and over deliver. And it's a wine that has this range. It's wine that is great for wine drinkers because it's nuanced and layered, and because it has it's a different wine every sip you take. And so wine drinkers will be really, really excited about having this wine, especially if you're having maybe spicy food, maybe Indian or Thai. And actually, people that are new to wine will enjoy the wine because the sugar left behind after fermentation will make that experience a little bit more enjoyable and easier to go through. So I feel like it's an everyday wine for every drinker.
It's fascinating because, as often does happen actually when I'm having these conversations, when I'm preparing what I want to ask you about, you've just started talking about it there, because as you've been talking, I've looked up the price on your website, and as you've just mentioned there, the price over in the UK, and I'm blown away because you're quite right. You know, I think it totally is over delivering, you know, for that price. And I'm just, you know, I think this might bring in different elements of the story, and this might be an interesting way to sort of close back even in on the early conversation about the grape growing. But like, how is it possible? Because I'm looking at your website here, and this is $9 on your website, and you know, £12 in the UK, and you know, it's such an accessible yet enjoyable, balanced. Or again, all of the things that you've just said there. How is that possible?
So there are a few factors that take part into building the price structure that we have in the Columbia Valley, and this is not unique to Chateau Saint Michel, although the scale helps bring the price down, right? But it's not unique to Chateau Saint Michel. I think what you'll find is that wines made in the Columbia Valley tend to be an amazing value. If you pay £10 for a wine, it probably tastes like you should have paid 17 or 18. If you pay £40, it probably tastes like you should have paid 80, and you get the idea. And I think it's a couple of reasons. It's not only the tools that we have as grape growers to make nuanced and very complex wines. It's also the availability of land, and so that is the cost of real estate, and then the cost of living in rural Eastern Washington, and all of that allows us to make wines that have depth, and they have a perspective and a point of view, wines that are exciting, wines that have a story to tell, yet we do so without the exorbitant prices that you will get from other wine regions that have been making wine for hundreds of years, and because of it, it just doesn't have perhaps the ability to let the incumbent make decisions that will make their wines affordable, or color outside the lines, and find ways to make the wines in certain style, or to fit certain budget. I find wines made in the Columbia Valley to be perhaps the ultimate value proposition. And I think all these factors that go into it, and for Chateau Saint Michel and the winery that I work for, it's easy. I told you earlier, we make more Riesling than any other winery in the world. And so I think the economies of scale help us and add yet another layer of value for our particular case. But I think it's a common thread through the wines that we make in the Columbia Valley. And, you know, I don't want to bore your audience with prices, but it's easy for us to find a hectare of land in Washington for maybe $35,000, maybe $40,000, where I don't think I can buy maybe a tenth of a hectare in Napa for that money. When you can produce Col Solare, which has perhaps the depth and the backbone that can compete, or that drinks like any Napa Cabernet, yet it's a tenth of the price. And I think that is the genesis of why Washington, it's a good value. So it's a combination of factors that allow us to present our wines in just such a good way, and which is what pushes me to tell people that I truly believe Washington will be one of the most influential wine regions in the world, because that combination, it's fairly unique, and nobody else can claim that.
One last question, really, to close out, and it's a kind of a two-pronged question, really. So I always like to finish with a future-oriented question. So what I'd ask you, Juan, is to look ahead and to tell us, what do you feel right here, right now, January 2021? What is the opportunity for Washington State and Columbia Valley over the next 5 years? Potentially thinking about marketing, potentially thinking about communication, and as a sort of a sub-question, over a slightly longer period, a sort of a 20, 25-year period, which may then bring in elements of winemaking and grape growing. And by all means, do feel free to draw in and refer back to anything else that you mentioned during the episode.
I am bullish about the future of the Columbia Valley as a grape growing region. I honestly believe that within our lifetime, we will be one of the most influential wine regions, and one region that people will be looking towards when it comes to innovation, when it comes to making wines that are relevant to the new wine drinker, and wines that are a lot more democratic than wine has been historically. Historically, we've been told this is how you drink your Tempranillos, and you better like it. And I think Washington has an opportunity to flip that concept on its head and ask the consumer, how is it that you are drinking your wines? What do you enjoy about wine? And deliver that, in a package that is a great value, and deliver that in a package that becomes a great experience. I feel like the next 5 years, we are going to focus on telling our story. We're going to focus on letting people know what makes Washington unique and special. And I think we will find ourselves in, winemakers and grape growers are very in tune with little nuances of the climate. And when the weather changes a little bit, one way or the other, we notice and we pay attention. And those nuances have a tremendous impact on the way the wines present themselves at the end of the road. And so I think Washington State will be, because of the conditions in which we grow our grapes, will be at the forefront of sustainability. We'll be thinking about 3, 4, 7, perhaps 20 generations in the future, being able to make wines in the same pristine conditions we are lucky enough to make them today. And that makes it just a very exciting place to be, both as a winemaker and as a wine consumer. So wines that have a point of view, wines that I can happily take to the next dinner party, whenever it is that we can get dinner parties going again. And as a consumer, knowing that it's a wine that comes from a group of people that are not only tremendously committed to the craft, but also committed to let generations ahead do the craft in the same conditions. And as a consumer, I cannot ask more from a wine region. And I think that as we tell our story, that will shine through the wines and will make people lean on Washington. And at some point, Washington will become the point place to go when you don't know what to drink on a Wednesday.
A huge thanks once again to Juan Muñoz Oca, Head of Winemaking and Vineyards at Chateau Saint Michel. Your episode perfectly lays the foundation for the series and sets us up to explore Yakima Valley and Walla Walla regions in the coming episodes. If you know someone who would find this episode useful, do please share the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/443. And if you really found it useful, then do please leave the episode an iTunes review on the same link. Thank you. Please see below for the website and main social media handles for Chateau Saint Michel. And do be sure to visit Washington State Wine online at washingtonwine.org. You can also find them on social media, where they're at Washington State Wine on Facebook, and WA_state_wine on Twitter and Instagram. Next time on the Washington State Wine Deep Dive 2021, I speak with second-generation winemaker Kerry Shields of Cote Bonville in the Yakima Valley. See you then.